You said crime rates are all-time high.
Shit, sorry, edit that out.
Yeah.
That's because I've had a couple beers and I've been watching the Blue Jays lose today.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is March 29th, 2018, and this is episode 79. Politicos is your weekly politics recap with a West Coast perspective. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you found us. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter where we're at PoliticosPod, and support the show at patreon.com/Politicos.
I'm Scott Blainboom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. Today, we're going to talk about the updates to the BC speculation tax, and then we have a couple interviews, first with Jesse Woodward to talk about Nanaimo politics, and then we brought on Michael Spratt randomly to talk about the federal Liberals Justice Bill that they dropped this afternoon. First, though, we have to thank our premier sponsors, Lindsay Tedds and Blake Hodson, for helping make the show possible. And Politicos is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's brand new daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have the unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicos receive 25% off subscriptions when you enter the offer code Politicos. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to britishcolumbiatoday.ca. For our first segment, Rebuilding the Cabin Tax, the NDP this week announced a raft of changes to this speculation tax that they put in the budget, which apparently won't cost them any money. Essentially, the NDP had been facing criticism largely from the BC Liberals and the media. I don't know how many people were actually upset other than people who don't live in the province.
And Michael Geller.
And a few people with 2+ homes. But they changed some of the geographic restrictions on this tax. They created a new rate structure where foreigners will have to pay 2% on the property value of their additional homes. People who are out of province will have to pay 1%, and British Columbia residents will only have to pay 0.5% additional property tax on their second, third plus homes that are in these zones. They're also exempting long-term rentals, and that definition changes from 3 months next year to 6 months in 2019, where it has to be occupied. And they're giving a tax credit to British Columbia residents up to $2,000 that's not available to others who have to pay the tax up front. But I think your favorite part of this is how they said before it would bring in $200 million, but with all these changes that kind of ratchet it down, they will still make $200 million.
Yeah, so they're charging fewer people less taxes than before, yet somehow it's going to not change the revenue at all, which doesn't make any sense.
I guess it's a very unknown kind of tax. Like when the BC Liberals brought in the foreign buyers tax, they didn't actually know how much revenue that would generate. I think they had some estimates, and then when we looked up the final result, it was actually a significant chunk of change. This kind of shows that the NDP's initial number was a stab in the dark. Like 200 million, that seems like a good guess. So if you change the inputs to your stab in the dark, it's still a stab in the dark.
Yeah, but you think it would change a little bit anyway.
It definitely hurts we know what we're doing, here's our 30-point plan, we thought this all through, underlying argument they were making, and it does give credit to that BC Liberal line of they're just making it up as they go along.
Yeah, and like one of the main points of the task wasn't so much revenue raising, it was to change behavior. And fine, like that's, if that's what you want to do and that's your main point of it, good. But like just don't count the revenue as a major part of it until you can figure out actually how much is coming in. And don't rely on it to then fund other programs.
Well, in the NDP's budget, the surplus was 250 in this range, and they'd set aside a bunch of contingency funds as well in the budget. So their argument is if we're wildly off, we have contingency funds. It's a tax, so it will guaranteed make revenue. It could crash the economy and therefore reduce other revenues, but overall, a new tax
it's probably not going to
can't lose the money. So,
well, there are taxes that are so horrendously complicated to administer and that affect such a small tax base. It's possible to create a tax that loses money, although this one doesn't seem to be one of those situations.
The other criticism of this set of changes seems to lie around the fact that certain municipalities that were really upset, namely Nanaimo and Kelowna, are still subject to it, while some others, like Parksville, I believe, and Hope and Harrison Hot Springs, are now exempt. And parts of the Gulf Islands, where I saw a number of articles pointing out, like, oh, here's Andrew Weaver's second home, or things like that. It might not have been him, or different NDP ministers who have property on the Gulf Islands. Now they're not subject to this tax. And it's that, shouldn't they have let Nanaimo and Kelowna out of this? Part of the point of the tax, though, I think, is to tackle the housing crisis, not just in Metro Vancouver, but in Victoria, in the major centers. And when you look at major centers in BC, the Kelowna-Okanagan area hits one of them. It's got a ton of vacation homes for sure, especially from people in Alberta and Metro Vancouver. But if Kelowna is to become a major center of BC, it needs to make that decision of, is it going to be the Whistler of the interior, or is it going to be a city that has people living in it that it can use to make revenue to fund social services to support the people living in it and build that cycle? I'm still not crying any tears for the people who are worried about having to pay a little bit more for their second or third home.
It's not a group that's particularly sympathetic, especially in the midst of a housing crisis. Some of the phrasing around the opposition to it of this is an envy tax or something just does not play well to anyone who doesn't have that second home.
Well, and the NDP's messaging on these updates was pretty fantastic, in my opinion. They talked about how 99% of British Columbians will not pay this tax. That was Carole James. And that just brings you back to the Occupy type, 99% versus the 1%. Now, this is a different 1% than the 1% of income owners. It's more like a 1% of wealth in a way, but it's still a real tangible difference. If you own multiple houses, you can always sell one and then you have money, and then you have income. And I just don't think the sympathy is out there for the 1% landowners at this point. It does frustrate the BC Liberal line where they don't like the idea of a wealth tax because it's an attack on the rich, and it pretty much is a sort of level of class warfare. But at the same time, 16 years of doing nothing was what kind of got us into this situation. So privileging the rich for 16 years is now being replaced by a modest tax on some people who have a second home.
Not really sure that's a fair characterization of the Liberals' legacy. But yeah, there was definitely a impetus for the government to take action on this file because it had been left too long without any.
My only other favorite criticism of the NDP on this was I heard some people talking about how the NDP is spending too much time listening to the economists and the academics. And it's highlighted how this was based off the housing affordability plan that I think we've talked to Tom Davidoff and others about in the past.
Yeah, and if they just gone ahead and didn't talk to any academics, didn't base it on anything, the attacks would be, oh my God, you're just throwing this new tax in without talking to a single economist about the impacts of it.
For the longest time, the NDP was the party that didn't listen to economists enough, and now they're listening to them too much. And this plan is not even the economist plan, because I think it does take into account annoying political realities for policy wonks like us.
Yeah, like there's no reason why a second home owned by a British Columbia has less of an impact than a second home owned by an Albertan. But they're subject to a different tax rate, probably because one can vote here and one cannot.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I don't think this is going to put the debate over this speculation tax to bed. I'm hopeful that when the legislature returns and the NDP gets started with their spring agenda, that's not just the budget, because they need to start introducing bills to at least legalize cannabis, if not do all the other things they promised, that might distract
we have
people.
To wait for the Senate to finally get in around to passing. So,
well, the BC legislature can move before the Senate. We can get things ready, which we have to do. But the only other thing I think we should mention while we're on this subject of this debate is there has been, I've noticed, a new raft of government of BC advertising around the budget, this tax a little bit, trying to sell it to the public. And when I saw some of these ads on TV and some on YouTube, even while scrolling through a Vancouver Sun article, I think about this tax, I saw an ad from the government about how great this BC budget is. They were similar to past ads that have been criticized by this BC NDP in the past, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly fair characterization. So there's a bit of it's one thing when we're in opposition, but now that we're in government, the thing we roundly criticize is actually okay, which is never a good look.
The idea of partisan, using the government for partisan ads is always going to be a contentious one. And I think most people, when you ask them, don't like it.
In fact,
it's really hard. I'm trying to find an argument to make in the NDP's favor, and I just...
Generally, the only people who argue in favor of that are the current government.
And there is the view that the government should be able to get its message out there. And there are good advertising campaigns that the government should be running. The one they're running on drug users right now, that every person out there, this is a hockey player, a dad, a drug user, a figure skater as well. Those ads that are on the subways and everything. I think those are fantastic ads. It's good public health PSA. But talking about the benefits of the budget has always been
advertising specific programs, so people who will benefit from those programs are aware of them and can take advantage. Yeah, that's one thing. But a look how great the government is something entirely different and really should not be the sort of thing government spend taxpayer money on.
But I haven't seen the opposition really jump on this yet as an issue, perhaps because the BC Liberals did it for so long. But maybe this is a place where the BC Greens and Andrew Weaver could bring another line of attack and say, why is the government spending so much money on these ads? Maybe they're not actually spending that much money. Maybe TV ads just aren't that expensive anymore.
Well, it's also the legislature's on break right now. So, yeah, we might see it in our first question period back.
We're on with Jesse Woodward, president of CHLY, the campus radio station at Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo, to talk about what the fuck's going on with Nanaimo. Welcome to Politicoast.
Hey, this is Jesse Woodward.
So, Nanaimo's come up on our radar a couple times, and it's local politics because there are these stories that we see come across our feeds that we're monitoring to find good stories, and it's really weird stuff, like someone uttered death threats against a sitting city councillor. Someone got arrested. There's corruption. So we kind of needed someone local to really just get us acquainted with what the hell is going on there. You were saying just before we got started here, we could probably go back about 4 years. Maybe just give us the overview of who the cast and characters are in the story that is Nanaimo politics today.
Well, Nanaimo city politics have been kind of, for lack of a better term, crazy since I moved to Nanaimo in 2003. But I guess I really started to follow it and pay more attention maybe 5 or 6 years ago when I was living away from Nanaimo. I was taking care of some family issues and wanting to connect with friends in Nanaimo via Facebook. And so what kind of set the scene for the current city council that we have now, which is almost coming to a close with elections in the fall, was basically this Colliery Dam debacle, for lack of a better term. Basically, the Colliery Dams are a old park in an old part of Nanaimo called Harewood. And I guess in the context of BC politics at the time, there was was it Mount Polly, the dam in the interior that lost, that basically busted?
Yes, that was the dam failure.
Yeah, so there was that dam failure in the background. And so what ended up happening was the then BC Liberal government basically did a review of all dams through BC, especially old ones not built to hydro code or something like that. And so the local dam here in the park came up as a potential dangerous dam in the event of an earthquake or 1,000-year storm was one of the quotes often used. And so basically there was an order from the provincial government for the local city council to do something about it. And what that something was kind of ambiguous. But eventually it worked out that like there needed to be a development of a spillway, and then like there was also rumors going on about like the dam being removed and possibly renaturalizing the park, which ultimately it ended up, for whatever reason, turning into like a lightning rod issue that like caused locals of all stripes in terms of like their politics to unite to stop anything from happening at the Colliery Dam in regards to spillways, its removal, all this stuff. And so ultimately what came out of that were some people managed to use it to get elected to city council as an issue. Some people got mired in the process and ended up like off city council, but it essentially set, I guess, what you would call up like a populist tone to like the next council in regards to who was there and who was willing to fight for like the neighborhood or whatever. And it also really set a negative tone towards like city councilors who were veterans and experienced and like maybe had some sort of like political awareness to them. So, and anyways, it set a really negative tone for the next council, the council that we're currently sitting in, and ultimately our then, I can't quite remember if they were calling him a chief administrative officer at the time, our then city manager ended up leaving the city within the year following the election. And then our current chief administrative officer, Tracy Samra, was appointed to that role, which was controversial in itself because she had actually been previously, I have to be careful with my words, I believe fired from the city where she was the head of legislative services. And then Tracy Samra was interim in that role, and then eventually ended up being hired officially as the chief administrative officer. And if you dig a little bit online, you can actually find that whole process was like mired in controversy and actually probably, well, I mean, I want once again to be careful with my words, but possibly corrupt.
I'm actually super curious about the opposition to repairing or improving the dam. Like, I get that often in local politics there's a very strong status quo bias, but what was the arguments against having it being seismically sound and having it being able to withstand severe storm events?
Part of it was the fear that the dam would be removed, and then there would be like a lack of access to the park as a swimming hole during the summer months. Harewood is, in the context of Nanaimo, like a poor neighborhood. I mean, there's access to like the aquatic center in that very same neighborhood, but you know, the aquatic center costs money for kids. And it's a natural little park in the middle of our city that is quite well loved. You know, like you kind of said about the status quo, people didn't want to see it change, didn't want to see trees removed. Eventually, the outcome of it was that they did not need to remove the dam, despite engineering reports, which kind of had a bit of a question mark on the need for its removal. But they did have to go through with an auxiliary spillway, which in itself was controversial in that, like, I can't believe we're spending money on this. You know, we shouldn't do anything that the government says in regards to this, and so forth and so on. But local governments need to cover their butt to ensure that they're doing their due diligence, and ultimately something got done. Quite possibly what needed to get done didn't get done, but I think only time will tell on that one. So, and then just one other thing too was that only actually the Colliery Dam Park actually has two dams. There's like the lower dam and the upper dam, and I don't even know if like the upper dam has been addressed in terms of what needs to happen. And that probably won't resolve itself maybe until the next term for city council.
So you have these two factions on the council, the populist new status quo group, I guess, and the more incumbent, I don't know, the Nanaimo elites, as it were. Is it mostly around this dam question, or are there other policy values differences between them? Or is that not a fair characterization?
It's kind of complicated in that, like, what you would call the five in Nanaimo is like a pretty tight but loose coalition of like downtown business owners, indigenous representation from our local Nanaimo First Nation. We have a long-term city councillor who's been involved in like hockey and sports. That's Bill Bestwick. Jerry Hong is like the downtown business owner. You've got Gord Fuller, who kind of came out of the populist movement of the dam, who has kind of teetered back and forth between like NDP and Green Party affiliation over the years. Although I think he certainly burned some bridges in the last 4 years in regards to any sort of affiliation that he might have had. And even burned the bridges that he had with the group that aligned itself around the dam. And then also in that group, you have Jim Kipp, who, oh God, my memory's failing on me, but I can't quite remember how long he's been on city council, but I think he's at least on his second term. And he's like a retired draftsman who used to do work for the city back in the day. And that group of five essentially has formed a bloc for voting that has aligned itself against our incumbent mayor, who this was his first term as mayor. He was a past city councillor in the last term, rather. And then there was Diane Brennan, who's a longtime city councillor. I think she got elected in the early 2000s, but it might have been the late 90s. And she's well known as like a New Democrat, and actually, I believe somewhere mid-2000s ran for mayor in Nanaimo, but failed in that bid and sat out for 4 years. And then beyond that, there were two new city councillors, Ian Thorpe, who was like a retired school teacher and got involved in terms of like outdoor recreation. And then there was also Wendy Pratt, who unfortunately last year ended up having to resign due to an incident with Tracy Samra, the city or the chief administrative officer, basically over an issue of like assault, essentially. In which case we had a by-election last year and elected a retired RCMP officer, Cheryl Armstrong, who now sits on council and is not aligned with the five. And anyways, it's kind of Game of Thrones on like a local Nanaimo level, and it's pretty juicy.
Okay, so two questions. First, I just want to clarify that unlike Vancouver, Nanaimo doesn't have parties. No, we don't have parties, which is, from my perspective, kind of frustrating because it would allow things to be a lot more organized going into the next election in the fall. Yeah. Right. Okay. And then the second question is, do you expand on that assault story?
So, sure. I mean, it's all out there on the internet, but essentially, at that time, I believe it was an in-camera meeting. It got to the point where basically Wendy Pratt was in on the meeting. The mayor was chairing the meeting. The five were there. I believe one of the other city councillors was absent. I think that was Diane Brennan, the long-term councillor, the veteran on council rather. But what ended up happening was some sort of argument developed, and apparently Wendy had been slowly been kind of brought to a boil over the course of the last few months prior to the event. But ultimately, Tracy Samra started recording the meeting on her cell phone, which was an in-camera executive session meeting. And I guess Wendy snapped and was like, I've had enough of this, stood up and walked over to Tracy and smacked her phone out of her hand, and ultimately was charged with assault. And then I believe, there's a term for it. It was handled in that I believe the term is via diversion. And so like no formal charges were laid, but ultimately the effect was that Wendy Pratt resigned from council, and then we ended up having to have a by-election to replace her under I think it's the community charter that handles by-elections and stuff like that. So,
and just for the listeners who don't follow council procedure, in camera, it's close to the public meeting.
Yeah, close to the public meeting. And so, I mean, the very fact that like a recording was being made in a close to the public meeting is, I mean, I sit on boards in regards to like nonprofits and stuff. I mean, even CHOI, for example, to be recorded in what's supposed to be a off the record meeting is kind of uncomfortable and not exactly what's supposed to happen. And given like the political nature of like the Five, and I guess what you could describe as an alliance with Tracy Samra, which you can see demonstrated in the hiring process that happened, Wendy probably had just had enough at that time. And I shouldn't make any excuses for her. I mean, it ultimately resulted in what was considered assault, but in any case, it resulted in one more mess coming out of this city council that like the public very much did not appreciate in Nanaimo. So,
well, and I'm assuming it's this tension and back and forth, well, more than just back and forth that you're talking about, that leads to Tracy being arrested in February. From one of the stories I found, where she was uttering threats against Mayor McKay and Diane Brennan.
I believe so. And then also, from my understanding, members of staff too, although their names escape me. I'd have to look that up online to clarify which staff member it was. So yeah, ultimately it came to a boil with like her basically threatening to, I believe it was shoot the mayor in the head and burn down houses. But it's absurd. It's been so beyond absurd that everybody in Nanaimo just cannot wait till the fall for the election.
And Tracy is still employed.
Yes,
right?
She's still employed. I believe she's on medical leave or sick leave or whatever the proper term is. But this also was during a period where she had sought employment at the Sea Schilt Band over on the Sunshine Coast there. And she was going to apparently leave her role at the city of Nanaimo. But ultimately, with this outburst with the mayor and being arrested and taken out of City Hall and being charged, they rescinded their offer to her.
Strange.
Yeah, and it's once again just incredibly absurd. Why would you do that? You had a job. You could have very much have left. And from my understanding, her contract, it's got like the ultimate sort of golden handshake of, your chief administrative officer leaving the city and, getting an absurd amount of severance too. Like, it just doesn't make any sort of sense when you look in from the outside without knowing any of the people directly involved on the inside. So
does that take us into this Our Nanaimo group that has formed as a sort of citizens' response?
Yeah, so I'm not a member of Our Nanaimo myself, but I know many of the people involved. And Our Nanaimo formed out of the movement to basically protest and work against the pro side for the referendum that we had last year. So basically a referendum was put forward to borrow money. I believe it was $80 million to build an event center, like a multiplex here, which was tied to possibly having a junior level hockey team move to the city to play here and be our team, which then tied itself into Councillor Bestwick and his history with being a hockey scout, and I'm possibly a coach. I can't quite remember that detail. But ultimately, they succeeded in basically fighting the referendum. There was an 80% no in regards to borrowing that kind of money, and that ultimately shut down the event center. And the five were very much in favor of the event center going forward in our local portlands here, which were purchased by the city of Nanaimo, I think sometime in the last 5 years. But the interesting thing is that this event center was part of no strategic plan that was ever established by any committee at the city, and was probably formulated in like the 6 months prior to the referendum as, this is our opportunity to make this happen. Strategy be damned. Committees
to
be
Nanaimo's
damned.
credit there, I mean, I think most cities that end up building some new sports arena tend to throw it together pretty quickly based on like one or two people's like really big ambition.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny too, because if you look back at it, it was originally proposed for this other part of Nanaimo in the downtown, where this old, what do they call it? It was like our old Howard Johnson motel. And they wanted to put it there. And people were kind of excited about the idea at the time because the Howard Johnson in Nanaimo it's an older building. It's kind of a little bit in disrepair. Having a event center there without any sort of taxpayer money being involved. If they want to build it, it would have been a pretty decent location for such a thing. But they later then proposed to move it to this other site and then get taxpayer money involved. And in hindsight, everybody's of the opinion that probably was just them testing the waters to see if there was an appetite in Nanaimo for such a thing. And, if there was an appetite, like, let's go grab some taxpayer money to make this happen too. So nevertheless, it ended up getting shut down. Our Nanaimo then coalesced from that group and is basically the organization that wants to elect other people this next election. So
they're the unofficial opposition slate?
Like, they're not an official electoral, or what's the proper term? An elector association. Like, they're not giving any money to any candidates, if they raise any money at all. They're mostly there to put forward questions and recommendations and kind of clarify which candidates who are running in the fall are good candidates versus those who are just running for some reason. So hopefully they do a good job with helping to vet candidates and get us out of this proverbial swamp that we seem to be in with our local municipal politics here. So
I'll give them a shout out for the chronologies on their website, which I've only actually just discovered now rather than it would have actually been useful for me to read these a week ago, but they're very thorough in documenting basically everything you're reviewing. And obviously they come from a certain slant, and so they won't represent the five, as you're saying, or some of the other movers and shakers, but they do say, this is the date that Tracy Samra did this, or so-and-so. And so
yeah.
I think that's a valuable tool that most cities don't have. And I guess it's good to see citizens actually starting to pay attention to their local politics and get involved in some way or take a concern for it.
Yeah, there's also like plenty of rumors going around too in regards to who will run for council, who will run for mayor. Currently, the big question mark in everybody's head is who's going to run for mayor. We have our local MLA here, Leonard Krogh, who people would love to see run for our mayor, and who knows what will happen there. There's also a rumor that just came up, I believe yesterday or the day prior, regarding our local former Conservative candidate in 2015, Mark MacDonald, running for mayor. But yeah, I suspect in the fall we'll have at least like 30, possibly 40 candidates running for the 8 seats for city council. So, I mean, I've already said the word absurd like 3 or 4 times, but I'll add another absurd in there because it's just going to be nutty.
Nanaimo's an at-large system as well, like Vancouver, I assume.
Yeah,
Most of BC, I think, is that way.
All
Yeah.
BC is.
Yeah.
It's made me study up on like ward systems and like why they're good and like why they're sometimes bad. And I just, yeah, I think this is kind of like the inevitable outcome of not having parties or a ward system or so forth and so on. But
It's not like parties keep that list much shorter if you've looked at the Vancouver ballots.
yeah, and that's something I wanted to inquire about in the future. I'm pretty politically keen, and it's always interesting to see how things work in different places. But yeah, it seems like Nanaimo, at least right now, is pretty standout in regards to the craziness of local municipal government. But every so often I look up other places on the Lower Mainland or out in Ontario, and it's like, oh, it's not just us, thank God.
Is there anything else in the recent history before we let you go that you think we missed or should really highlight in covering what is Nanaimo today?
Well, I think given that we're like months away from the next election, you can definitely see politics being played in regards to looking for votes. I mean, our last controversy with city council was this money that was available for supported housing. And so there was a site selected in the south end of Nanaimo in what we call Chase River that had been basically earmarked for this project sometime last year in October or November. And, you know, it was a decision that was made. This is an excellent location. We got the money coming from the government. The supported housing is going to be run by Pacifica Housing out of Victoria, which is headed up by former mayor of Victoria, Dean Fortin. And it seemed like it was going to be on schedule and it was going to happen. And then somewhere along the lines, there was an open house meeting and the mayor was in attendance and one of the city councillors from the 5 was in attendance, and the rest were all gone at a training session, for local city government over in Vancouver. And the messaging regarding the whole thing just got bungled. And so the words, wet housing were dropped, and, they got way off topic in regards to what was actually in the proposal for the site, which was supported housing for seniors at risk of going homeless, people with disabilities, etc., and so forth. So they basically miscommunicated to the public in the neighborhood that this was going to be for street people and drug addicts, and it was going to bring basically these bad seeds into the neighborhood, which was not the case if you had, taken your time to read the proposal. And we have had housing from Pacifica in Nanaimo in the north end built to completion, and it's functioning perfectly. It's doing what it needs to do. It hasn't caused any problems in the neighborhood. There had been some pushback before it was completed and built, but ultimately that the fears of the neighborhood were unfounded. It just so happens, though, that with this one and the miscommunication and the bungling, it ultimately led to the neighborhood really stepping up in regards to like pushing back against it. The location was in proximity of a elementary school, a boys and girls club, and ultimately sometime, I believe it was in January or maybe early February, when presented with pushback from the neighborhood, particularly the side of the 5, basically made an effort to relocate it and cancel the proposed location. And ultimately, it resulted in the project just not going ahead, us not getting the money for supported housing from the new Democratic government, and that money going to Parksville, which is north of Nanaimo. So I have the feeling that some of the people who were against it on council were trying to score political points for the fall, just because it's not that far away, and they shot down a really fantastic initiative, which would have been beneficial, I believe, at least for Nanaimo. But in any case, that was the last issue.
Was this the project that led to the tent city setting up on Nanaimo City Council's front yard?
Yeah, that was the root of that. And then ultimately, I think the tent city lasted, about 2 weeks. And then there was an effort to relocate it to some local Nanaimo parkland. And when it was relocated, it was then pointed out that where the campers were at this park that they were moved to was actually private land. So what ended up happening was they ended up being located to this park. And it just so happens that the section of the quote unquote park that they were located or relocated to was actually private property. And so they ended up having to leave within a day or two because there was actually nowhere in the park proper where they could actually camp. So, the homeless in Nanaimo who were at City Hall have spread to the four winds into, local green spaces and just into the bush essentially, or into wherever they can get to keep their heads dry and stuff. So nothing's being solved in regards to local homelessness issues, be it drug issues, mental health, or just, seniors or people with disabilities at risk of going homeless. So it's quite frustrating, but it is what it is until we can change things here. So,
well, I think that covers all the ground and all the questions we have. Maybe you could just close out by telling people where they can find you and how they can stay informed with what's going on in Nanaimo until we get you back.
I can be found on Twitter at ICO, NOCO. It should read as Iconico. I occasionally post about graphic design. There's a lot of my Instagram photos there, a little bit about Nanaimo city politics and just Canadian politics in general. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not a huge Twitter user. I'm mostly on Facebook, and you can find me under the same username. But if you want to stay more abreast of Nanaimo local city politics, Facebook is actually probably your best bet. And there's groups on there such as a Better Nanaimo or Our Nanaimo. And you can keep informed in those locations. Those are Facebook groups. So, and then outside of that, there is a website run by a retired South African journalist who lives in Nanaimo called News Nanaimo. And it's started out as a bit of a blog, but it's turned into something more and more like a proper news site. And the man who runs that is Dominic Jones, but sometimes, I don't know, I'm of the perspective that you sometimes need to look at it or take it with a grain of salt, because I guess sometimes it runs into opinion versus editorialization. But yeah, it's a reasonably good resource. So anywho, I'm going to have to kick off here. I'm at the station right now, and we have some people coming in, so it's going to get a little noisy here.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us.
Well, welcome to Politicos, friend of the podcast, Michael Spratt. Thanks for taking the spontaneous time this evening to join us.
Thanks for having me. I'm depressed for multiple reasons today.
So we wanted to bring you on because there's this new justice bill. This is the 3rd, 4th, 12th justice bill the Liberals have introduced, perhaps?
They seem to be not, they haven't reached the counting stats that we've seen under the past Conservative governments, but they have introduced more than one. I can tell you that I measure justice bills that governments have introduced by the amount of times I go to the Senate to testify on those bills. And today was the first time that I've been to the Senate under the Liberal government to testify on one of their bills, the marijuana bill. So by that measure, they're not reaching the same stats the Conservatives did. That's for sure.
Well, I guess they're able to introduce them, but not maybe pass them. I know I'm watching one of the zombie reform bills, the new C-51, and I think it's stalled at first or second reading in the Senate. So it was interesting to see them bring forward this bill to what CBC described as unclog Canada's courts.
Yeah, and the really interesting thing about this bill is it takes some of the old bills that have been stalled at various points and sort of wrapped them up and restarted them back in this sort of omnibus bill. So we get to redo all of the things that we've done about victim fine surcharges and some other sorts of zombie laws and cleaning up the criminal code and things like that. So it should be fun. There's certainly a lot of work to be done on this one.
So why don't you just walk us through what are kind of the major new elements in this one?
So, as you guys said, this bill was sort of introduced at a press conference, and the Justice Minister said that, primarily it's going to introduce some fairness into the justice system, and it's going to unclog our courts and speed things up. And really, there's a handful of sort of major things that it does. The first thing is it eliminates preliminary inquiries, which are, evidentiary hearings before a matter goes to trial to make sure that there's enough evidence to actually proceed to trial. This bill eliminates those in all cases except where an accused person is facing life imprisonment. So, murder, large-scale conspiracies, alarming Her Majesty, offenses like that. The next thing this bill does is it responds to the Colton Boushie case from last month, showing that this government can actually advance justice reform rather quickly when it wants to. And this bill eliminates peremptory challenges that is challenges that the Crown and defense can use in a jury trial to automatically excuse a certain number of jurors each, depending on the level of charge. So the other thing that this bill does is it allows the Crown to introduce evidence from police officers in affidavit or documentary form instead of viva voce or through live testimony. And it's up to the defense counsel to bring an application before the trial judge to actually cross-examine police officers. It also creates reverse onus hearings, bail hearings for domestic allegation charges. It also says that it's going to move forward with the victim fine surcharge legislation to restore some judicial discretion to surcharges that are imposed. It does a whole number of things, and really the problem, it doesn't do any of those things very well.
I guess there's been two lines of criticism very quickly at this bill. One, like you're saying, the limitations of what it does do, but also the other being what it doesn't do. And the one that's coming up right away is it doesn't touch on the mandatory minimums that the Liberals and NDP have been highly critical of the Conservatives for introducing, but then the Liberals haven't seemed to have touched.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, that's, of course, in the context of this bill that does things like removing preliminary inquiries, which comprise about 3% of court cases, 3% of our court time. And actually, the evidence shows and our experience demonstrates that preliminary inquiries actually focus matters and lead to speedier trials, more focused and shorter trials. And actually, I've had a number of experiences where, a day or two in a preliminary inquiry avoids, a month-long trial altogether. So at the same time that there's these measures that are said to speed things up that actually aren't going to speed things up at all, the government hasn't tackled minimum sentences, which everyone agrees is a drain on our system and clogs our courts. And they haven't tackled it, despite the fact that we have decades and decades of evidence, expert evidence of parliamentary committees about the impacts and costs of minimum sentences, and despite the fact that we have provincial courts, Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court of Canada all weighing in on some of the very negative and, according to the Supreme Court, unconstitutional aspects of minimum sentences.
So why do you think the government's been so slow to actually take any action on this file in terms of the minimum sentences?
Well, I think that it's comes down to a crass sort of political calculus. I would expect that the first fundraising email sent out by the Conservatives would be about how the Liberals are soft on crime and how they want, people who deal drugs or commit assaults or, engage in harmful activities. They want to go easy on them. And I expect that as we get closer and closer to the next election, there's probably going to be more and more reluctance on the part of the government to actually follow through on what was a very public and important promise that not only was made by the Justice Minister, but was directly addressed by the Prime Minister before the last election.
So you mentioned the Gerald Stanley case of the death of Colton Boushie, and that's clearly one of the motivations for this. There was also the Jordan ruling that I think you've alluded to, the fact our trials are taking too long, and so justice delayed is justice denied kind of issue. There was also, I saw this countrywide consultation that just wrapped up, this 18-month report that highlighted the issues of administration of justice offenses that are creating backlogs. Does this really help address those kind of issues around probation and breaking bail hearings, or is it a bit too short of the mark?
I think that, unfortunately, this bill, at least on first reading and everything that I've seen so far, and it's a bill that spans over 300 pages, it falls short of the mark in all of those aspects. Going back to the Gerald Stanley and Colton Boushie case, there was some concern there that the defense counsel in that case was using peremptory challenges to exclude Indigenous jurors. And I think that this bill is a direct response to that. Unfortunately, what we learned under the Conservatives is that when you legislate in response to specific, isolated, and unusual cases, you usually come up with some pretty bad legislation. And, what we know as defense counsel is that we use those peremptory challenges to actually increase diversity on a verdict, on a jury. So, when I'm in a jury trial and I've got my client who's, a racialized individual, and he sees that, we have 10 white jurors selected, and I'm looking at the jury lineup and there's 2 other jurors we need to select. And I see that there's, racialized or Indigenous individuals, but they're, 5 jurors away. I can use my peremptory challenges to challenge the next 5 jurors to actually get to that racialized individual to increase diversity on a jury. That's how we normally use peremptory challenges. And by taking them away, I think we're actually going to have, whiter juries. And, with the administration of justice offenses, so this is, failures to appear in court, or, they impose a condition on an alcoholic not to drink alcohol, and he's caught drinking alcohol and rearrested for that offense. This bill does attempt to deal with that, but it does so in ways that I think are actually going to disproportionately impact and or not be applicable to marginalized individuals. It leaves that discretion in police officers' hands about whether to charge or not charge. And we know from the application of marijuana laws and other offenses that disproportionately police choose to charge people who are either marginalized or racialized. And then even if an officer decides not to charge in those administration of justice offenses, there's still a hearing that appears to be contemplated by this legislation, where the person will have a hearing in front of a judge. There'll be sort of a mini trial to see if that breach allegation, that non-compliance with bail occurred. And then if it's proven that it did, the judge can either take no action or modify the conditions or detain someone. So all of these sort of breach offenses appear to still be headed to a trial in our courts. So it's hard to see how it's actually going to save time.
Well, and you mentioned marijuana and cannabis, and that's one of the things NDP justice critic Alistair McGregor was pointing out, that they are still going to be charging people with pot possession for the next few months while we wait for the Senate to get around to passing the Cannabis Act and decriminalizing and legalizing big chunks of that industry, which, again, I'm sure you have many more thoughts, and we've talked about the limits of that bill. But in this meantime, we're still putting people in jail for something that's so close to being legal. BC isn't. We don't care as much about that anymore because we've moved on. But Ontario, I think, isn't as progressive at times.
Well, and we have a sort of disproportionate charging across the country, which is never a good thing when people are treated differently depending on where you live. And we may not be seeing a lot of charges in British Columbia, and it does appear that charge rates are going down for marijuana. But the fact of the matter is we still have thousands of people charged in the last year for minor marijuana offenses. And so if we really care about streamlining the justice system and ensuring that our courts aren't clogged, we have to be, I think, a little bit more principled and a little bit more ambitious than just standing up at a press conference and saying that that's what we want to do. I think we really have to take active steps to decouple mental health issues and addiction issues and poverty from the criminal code. I mean, I still have clients who are charged with shoplifting small amounts of food because, they're homeless. There's no reason that those charges should be, before a court and should be taking time away that should rightly be spent on adjudicating and prosecuting serious violent offenses.
I was going to say, I love the idea of, love is not the right word, but the idea of someone being arrested for stealing a loaf of bread when Loblaws, as far as I know, hasn't really faced a huge blowback yet for its price fixing for years on the price of bread. But maybe I'll throw it over to Scott for the next question.
Yeah, so touching off on some of the change you'd like to see, if you're Justice Minister Spratt here, how would you go about reforming this piece of legislation? What would you like to see in it?
Well, I mean, I think that we need to start with actually reversing some changes that have increased delays over the last number of years. I mean, one thing that we know is that crime rates are at an all-time low. And our courts and our jails are, fuller than they've ever been. And so we need to look at the cause of that. And the cause of that is the increased use of mandatory minimum sentences and the elimination of sort of creative community-based sentencing options like house arrest or, other sorts of collaborative justice. So I think what, we need to see in a bill is we need to actually focus our criminal law on what's important. The criminal justice system is such a bad tool for sort of social engineering and social policy. I think that if we spent more money on frontline mental health workers, on treatment, less money on police, we'd see less people in the system. And I think we can all agree that if we have a choice between prosecuting a homeless individual who has stolen food because they're hungry, or someone who has, failed to appear in court because they're marginalized and they simply forgot about the court appearance and turned themselves in, at the first available opportunity, we shouldn't be focusing our resources on those individuals. We should actually be looking at serious crimes. So I think there's ways to streamline and slim down the criminal code to make sure that, we have offenses that are modern, so we can look at, directing resources at online crime, at, large-scale frauds, at corporate crime, and we can sort of turn our focus away and decriminalize some things. Firstly, we should decriminalize all drug possession. And secondly, we should look at seriously decriminalizing all poverty-based offenses. There's no reason why, minor property offenses, minor shoplifting offenses can't be dealt with outside of the criminal justice system. That's not to say we shouldn't hold people accountable and seek reparations, but there's other ways that we can deal with it better in other statutes besides just the criminal code.
So alarming the Queen also don't be out?
Take alarming the Queen out. We don't need to have a theft section, a theft of cattle, a theft of mail, a theft from clam beds. I mean, we can streamline this criminal code. One of the principles that we have in our criminal law is that everyone's presumed to know the criminal law. And of course, that's fanciful because I don't even know all of the sections in the criminal code because it's an unwieldy book. We need to streamline it and we really need to focus it. We need to make sure that courts have the discretion to craft sentences that are actually going to rehabilitate individuals and keep the community safe. But I mean, I think just saying that we want to have an inclusive and progressive criminal justice system, I mean, it's nice that we're having a government say that, but through this legislation that we've seen, and even through the cannabis legislation, I was testifying on that in the Senate today. I mean, this just isn't the progressive legislation that's promised. There's a real disconnect between, how this government talks about the legislation and what the legislation actually says and does.
Maybe the last question I really have so we can let you go for your evening. Is there anything in this bill you actually do like? What's the best parts of this bill? Or that you've more generally seen the Liberals move forward on justice issues?
Well, I mean, I think it's good that that we have some measures in here to increase judicial discretion. The victim fine surcharge changes that the Conservatives brought in, making those victim fine surcharges mandatory in all cases. And that means imposing surcharges of thousands of dollars on individuals who will never be afford to pay it and will suffer consequences from not paying it. It's good that the Liberals have wrapped sort of that bill back into this bill. But I mean, that's something that could be advanced independently. Are there good things in this bill? I mean, I guess it's good that we can try to divert some of these administration of justice offenses away from the criminal courts. But the way that it's being done is so political, is so short-sighted, and really misses the mark. And I think the biggest disappointment here is that we have a government who seems to be able to spring into action and throw legislation together, in a month's notice when they feel like it. But they seem unable to deliver on so many promises that they've made that have been outstanding for so long. It's very disappointing moving towards the next election. And I mean, I have doubts whether this bill will actually make it all the way through the process. But I think this has sealed the deal. We're not getting anything else from this government. And I think that's the real missed opportunity cost here.
Just one other question before I let you go. Something that jumped out at me in the CBC article is they're making strangulation an elevated form of assault. Just kind of, what's the rationale there? It seemed such a weird little thing to highlight.
Yeah, they've done some strange things. I mean, I will say this. One thing that they've done in this bill is increased limitation periods for when they can charge people with offenses. It used to be that for a summary conviction offense, if the charge wasn't laid within 6 months, then there was a bar to proceeding. And that often meant that they proceeded by indictment, the more serious mode of offense. So I mean, that's a good thing. Strangulation, I mean, has always been a separate and sort of aggravating form of assault, sort of the choking charges that we see in the criminal code. And that's a recognition of just the danger that is inherent in that type of assault. It is so easy to cause, death and injury that way, as opposed to, other methods of assault. It's really a form of domination that can lead to very serious consequences. But the other thing that they've done in this bill is that they've increased the maximum sentences for every single summary conviction offense across the board in a blanket way. It used to be that we would have a maximum offense based on the seriousness of the crime. So for a minor shoplifting, 6 months was the maximum. For possession of marijuana, 6 months was the maximum. For a serious assault, 18 or sort of a moderate assault, 18 months was the maximum. But they've increased all of those to 2 years as the maximum offense. So whether it's a minor shoplifting, a major fraud, a more serious assault, they're all up to 2 years, which I think is also going to cause some delays in the justice system because it's going to make sentencing more complicated. I think that we're going to see arguments from the Crown saying that this means that the government is indicating to us that we should elevate sentences and have harsher sentences. And it just seems that is another example of just sort of an odd thing thrown into this bill that doesn't really have much of a rationale or much, evidence behind why you would include it. A lot of this bill, I think, is, policy-based evidence making as opposed to what was promised, which, was evidence-based policy making. And I think that we should have an interesting time going forward with this bill at both debate and especially at committee. And it's going to be very interesting to see if maybe on this bill, unlike every other bill that we've seen from this government, if the government will be open to any amendments or not.
Well, I'm sure you'll have lots more to say about this bill on your own podcast. Maybe you could just remind listeners who, for some reason, might not be subscribed, what that is and where they can find you for more of your random opinions.
So if you want to hear any more random opinions, any more rants, or any more considered and nuanced opinions from my partner and co-host, Emily Tamman, you can check out our podcast. It's called The Docket, and you can find it at my website, michaelspratt.com, or you can find it on SoundCloud or on iTunes. And if you want to follow me for my hot takes on justice bills, baseball, and all manner of things relating to what my children did and how they have offended me, you can follow me on Twitter at mspratt.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks for joining us.
No problem. Have a good night, guys.
Well, moving on to Twit Takes. BC Liberal MLA Dan Davies was injured this past week. Most interestingly, at his other job at Inland Concrete up in Fort St. John, which generally such jobs are not the sort of thing you see MLAs doing.
Well, the current leader, Martin Ouellet of the Bloc Québécois, has a second job as a member of the National Assembly in Quebec. But
is being a bloc leader even really a job anymore?
Yeah. When you're a provincial elected official, you don't generally hold a second job. Some small town councillors might hold a second job.
It's actually fairly common on councils of smaller places, even within the metro area here.
Or even our school board and park board don't pay full-time hours. But our MLAs are compensated for a full-time amount of work because we want them to be able to do that. I think it's a good thing. But
so yeah, this was just, I guess, curious in the fact that it's unusual for an MLA to hold a second job.
Yeah, he apparently drives cement trucks. Maybe he does enjoy it, and I won't begrudge him for that if it keeps him with his community. And he is recovering okay, so I don't feel too...
we do want to extend our best wishes to him,
and
of course.
The Premier's expended his best wishes, and the Leader of the Opposition, that's all good. I think the political angle also comes in with how tight the legislature's seating plan is. What I would expect and hope would happen is the NDP would be kind enough to do a vote-type match situation where they said, all right, your one MLA can't attend for health reasons. We'll have someone sit out vote. So it's not a disadvantage to you because of luck. Then again, even without that move, the NDP and Greens still hold enough votes to win. So it may or may not happen, but it would be a good sign. And that has happened in other legislatures and parliaments. But hoping Dan Davies can return for the legislature when it returns in a couple weeks. So Earth Day happened this past weekend, and I only learned about it after getting back from Manning Park. And so I was lucky being on vacation in a place with no cell service that I probably did use less electricity than I normally would have. I think I was watching a movie during Earth Day in my hotel room, so I hadn't shut all the lights out. But it turned out this year BC used more power during that hour. So why is Earth Day still a thing?
Lets everyone feel good about themselves for 60 minutes every year and feel like they're making a difference, and then go right on to the same stuff they do for the other 8,759 hours a year. So people, I guess it just exists because it's one of those symbolic things that for some reason has trickled its way into the general consciousness.
I'm not against awareness campaigns broadly. I think there is a value to them at some level. I do think perhaps Earth Hour, at least in Canada, has outlived its success, and the World Wildlife Federation that runs it either needs to massively retool it for a new era, as it were, find a different hook for next year, or shelve it and just launch an entirely different awareness campaign to try to really highlight the importance of energy conservation and saving the planet. Because the fact that we're using more electricity and people are forgetting to turn out their lights means it's not working anymore. And so if you want to get across these messages, you need to innovate.
Well, the BC government's attempts to block the Trans Mountain Pipeline were set back this week when the Federal Court of Appeals ruled that the BC government's attempt to appeal a previous ruling that said the local bylaws in Burnaby couldn't actually stop a federally approved pipeline got rejected. And so the Trans Mountain Pipeline will not be subject to Burnaby's zoning code or tree protection bylaws.
This is one of multiple tools in the tool chest, I guess. It's not going to be the last court appearance for Trans Mountain and the province of BC in some way, shape, or form. I'm not the legal expert on this area by any stretch, and as far as it seems, Trans Mountain's probably got a strong hand to play in each of these cases.
Yeah, and like it's been pretty much agreed to by everyone but Burnaby that municipal governments don't actually have the power to stand in the way of anything that's in federal jurisdiction.
But part of it here is that attrition strategy almost, the how long can we set this off? I think there was some news recently about Kinder Morgan's stock dropping a little bit or getting set back a little bit. And there was more news about protesters either getting arrested. I think it was this last
Elizabeth
week.
May.
And Kennedy Stewart. 2 MPs were arrested this past week. I think John Horgan was even talking today or yesterday about how he expects even more chaos, as it were, to erupt around this. So we're a long ways from done this fight, and I think things are only really just heating up.
This challenge never really had much of a shot, I think, precisely because of that rather clear constitutional question was more or less being resolved. But the BC government's reference case they're sending up, I think, might have a little more of a chance. This was the one they've decided to do rather than fight the pipeline wine war.
So we'll wait and see how the reference case goes and how many more MPs, protesters are arrested and where this all heads, because people are getting up in arms. But things that aren't really taking off are apparently the federal Liberals' infrastructure projects, as the parliamentary budget officer released a report this week saying the Liberals' planned $14 billion infrastructure investment strategy has been like 50% successful in terms of getting projects off the ground and far less successful in actually driving our economy like the Liberals promised.
Yeah, so we talked about this last time the slow pace of infrastructure spending came up, and there's just the reality that you don't often have a lot of shovel-ready projects just waiting for funding. So there's some legitimate points on that, and the Liberals probably should have known that before they promised to front-load their infrastructure spending. When they first unveiled the spending in the 2016 budget, they predicted a 0.9% economic growth as a result of that, which is significant, and followed by 1.4% the following year. And it turns out it's maybe more like a 0.1%. So order of magnitude-ish smaller than anticipated, which made sense because nearly a full percentage point of growth from a few $1 billion of spending is an ambitious goal.
That would be nice if you could do that, though. That'd be very easy to run a government and just make promises like, I will get in, and for every $1 billion we spend, we will raise the economy by 0.1%. And just economically, all you have to say is, oh, we need to raise the GDP by this much? Well, we'll just spend exactly that much. It's funny how math doesn't tend to work out like that when you're running a country of 36 million people spread over a lot of space. Still, they got to the Liberals' partial credit, I guess, since this follows nicely from our discussion with Michael Spratt. The Liberals do things that seem like they're in the right direction, but then only get part of the way there, at least in, I guess, his and my view at least. They got 1,100 projects going, which is not an insignificant amount, and have spent $7.5 billion, and it gets needed infrastructure going. One of the ways that a lot of governments balance a budget or whatever is building that infrastructure debt. That was the Klein legacy in Alberta, was let's stop spending on hospitals and literally blowing them up in favor of cutting a short-term deficit. And now you pay for that in the future. And so these are long-term payouts, even if they don't necessarily raise the economy as much as promised.
And I guess to the Liberals' credit, they might have realized this because they did shuffle some more of their infrastructure spending off into the future. Of course, it was way off into the future rather than just a couple of years, but I think they are slowly coming around to the fact that you can't just have billions of dollars worth of infrastructure projects sitting ready to go at a moment's notice.
We cut Best of BC Poly last week, and we don't actually have anything to include this week again. Maybe with the legislature not in sitting, BC Poly Twitter's a little less active than recently. Maybe we've just been too busy with other projects to pay attention to BC Poly Twitter as devoutly as we should have. But I'll put it out there again. If you like this segment and want to see it continue, we need your support, listeners. Follow Twitter for us and send us those best tweets. We might not use them, but we can't use the ones we don't get. So tag those with hashtag #BestofBCPoly. Send them to us in DM if you don't want to be named. Figure it out. We hope to see the best tweets, and we want to make fun of or celebrate the humor that can happen in this province.
And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes. Make sure to subscribe or listen to podcasts and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access to our interviews at patreon.com/Politicos. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.